Most people lose not because they lack intelligence, talent, or opportunity. They lose because they panic. They react when they should think. They speak when they should observe. They rush when they should remain still. The truth is simple. When pressure enters the room, character is revealed. This audiobook is about developing the rare habit of staying calm while others fall apart. Not because life becomes easier, not because problems disappear, but because the calmest person in the room is usually the one who sees clearly, decides wisely, and wins consistently. If you can master your emotions when everyone else loses control, you gain an advantage that no degree, title, or talent can replace. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Stop reacting to everything. Most people believe stress is the biggest problem in their lives. It isn't. Stress is not the real enemy. The real enemy is what happens next. The real enemy is the way they respond when stress shows up. Think about your average day. Not a terrible day, not a crisis, just an ordinary Tuesday. You wake up with good intentions. You plan to get things done. Maybe you want a peaceful morning, a productive afternoon, a quiet evening. Then life begins. Someone cuts you off in traffic. The coffee spills. A message you were expecting never arrives. A coworker says something that feels disrespectful. A family member makes a comment that hits a nerve. A bill arrives unexpectedly. The line at the store takes forever. The internet stops working right when you need it most. Small things, tiny things, the kinds of things that happen to everyone. And yet for many people, those small moments are enough to completely change the course of an entire day. Why? Because they react immediately, emotionally, without thinking, without pausing, without questioning whether the reaction is helping them or hurting them. They hand over control of their emotional state to whatever happens around them. A stranger can determine their mood. A delay can determine their attitude. A problem can determine their behavior. And before they realize it, they are no longer living intentionally. They are simply reacting to life. That's how many people spend their years, not choosing how they feel, not directing their thoughts, not deciding who they want to be. Instead, they allow circumstances to make those decisions for them. One negative comment ruins an entire morning. One criticism echoes in their mind for hours. One inconvenience follows them all day long like a shadow. Then they go to bed exhausted and wonder why life feels so heavy. The answer is simpler than most people realize. They're carrying far more emotional weight than they need to, because they are constantly reacting. Reaction is weakness. Response is power. Remember that. Reaction is weakness. Response is power. Most people spend years trying to gain control over the outside world. They want better circumstances, better timing, better opportunities, better people around them. But very few people ever stop long enough to ask a more important question. Can I control myself? Because that's where real power begins. The person who reacts is controlled by circumstances. The person who responds remains in control despite circumstances. That distinction changes everything. You have a choice, not once, not occasionally. Every day, every hour, every conversation, every challenge, every disappointment. You have a choice. You can react or you can respond. And the quality of your life is shaped by that decision more than almost anything else. Think back to the last time someone criticized you. Maybe it happened at work. Maybe it happened at home. Maybe it happened years ago and you still remember it. What was your first reaction? Did you instantly become defensive? Did you begin explaining yourself before the other person even finished speaking? Did you replay the conversation over and over in your head while trying to prove you were right? Most people do. Not because they're weak, not because they're bad people, but because nobody ever taught them the difference between an event and their reaction to that event. That's the key. The event is rarely the problem. The reaction is. The criticism lasted 30 seconds. The emotional aftermath lasted 3 days. The comment was small. The reaction turned it into something enormous. How many nights have people lost sleep over a sentence spoken in passing? How many relationships have been damaged because somebody reacted instead of responding? How many opportunities have been lost because emotion took control before wisdom had a chance to speak? This is how unnecessary suffering is created, not by life itself, but by our inability to manage our response to life. Reaction is weakness. Response is power. Now let's bring this into everyday reality. Imagine you're sitting at your desk at work. It's already been a long day. You're tired. You're trying to stay focused. Then an email arrives. The tone feels sharp, dismissive, maybe even disrespectful. Instantly you feel it. Your stomach tightens, your heart rate increases, your mind starts building a case. You begin drafting a response before you've even finished reading the message. You want to defend yourself. You want to correct them. You want them to know they're wrong. So you hit send. A few minutes later, another email arrives, then another. Now your manager's involved. Now the tension is growing. Now what could have been a minor misunderstanding has become a real conflict. And when you look back, you realize something important. The original email wasn't the real problem. The reaction was. Reaction is weakness. Response is power. The same thing happens online every single day. Someone posts an opinion you disagree with. You feel pulled into the conversation, almost as if you have no choice. You type a response. They reply. You reply again. Soon an hour has disappeared. Then two. Your energy is gone. Your focus is gone. Your peace is gone. And what changed? Usually nothing. The argument remains. The disagreement remains. The world continues moving exactly as it was before. Yet countless people repeat this cycle every day. Why? Because reaction feels natural. But natural is not always useful. Natural is not always wise. Natural is not always productive. You have a choice. You do not need to attend every argument you are invited to. You do not need to prove yourself to everyone. You do not need their permission to remain silent. You do not need their approval to walk away. And you certainly do not need to win every battle. Some battles are won by refusing to fight them. Sometimes the strongest response is no response at all. Sometimes silence says more than words ever could. Now think about family, because this is where emotional reactions often do the most damage. A spouse says something frustrating, a parent makes an unfair remark, a brother or sister pushes a button they've been pushing for years. Immediately, emotions rise, voices get louder, defenses go up. Everyone starts focusing on being right instead of understanding one another. A conversation becomes an argument becomes a conflict. A conflict becomes a wound that lasts far longer than it should. But calm people approach these moments differently. Not because they never feel hurt, not because they never feel angry, but because they understand a simple truth. The first emotion is not always the best emotion. The first impulse is not always the wisest action. The first reaction is rarely the final answer. So they pause, and that pause changes everything. The pause creates space. The pause interrupts old patterns. The pause gives wisdom time to catch up with emotion. Most people underestimate what a few seconds can do. A few seconds can save a marriage. A few seconds can preserve a friendship. A few seconds can prevent years of regret. That's the key. Power does not live in speed. Power lives in the pause, not in intensity, not in emotion, not in volume. In the pause, reaction is weakness, response is power. And here's something important. Many people hear the word calm and assume it means suppressing emotions. It doesn't. Calm people are not emotionless. They feel anger, they feel disappointment, they feel fear, they feel frustration, they feel all the same emotions everyone else feels. The difference is that they don't allow those emotions to take the steering wheel. They acknowledge the feeling without surrendering to it. They experience anger without becoming anger. They experience fear without becoming fear. They experience disappointment without becoming disappointment. That's a critical distinction. It's not about eliminating emotion. It's about managing emotion. It's not about pretending you don't care. It's about deciding how you will act. You have a choice, always. A calm person may feel angry, but they choose their response. A calm person may feel afraid, but they choose their response. A calm person may feel frustrated, but they choose their response. That is discipline. And discipline creates freedom. Many people believe freedom means doing whatever they feel like doing. But real freedom is something deeper. If every emotion controls you, you are not free. You are trapped, a prisoner of impulse, a prisoner of mood, a prisoner of circumstance. Real freedom is self-control. Real freedom is choosing your actions instead of obeying your emotions. That's the key. Which brings us to one of the most valuable habits you can ever develop. Pause first. Decide second. Say it again. Pause first. Decide second. When someone insults you, pause first. Decide second. When a plan falls apart, pause first. Decide second. When fear appears, pause first. Decide second. When frustration rises, pause first. Decide second. This habit seems simple. But simple does not mean weak. Simple habits change lives, not overnight, not instantly, but steadily. Every time you pause, you reclaim a little more control. Every time you pause, you strengthen emotional discipline. Every time you pause, you become less reactive and more intentional. And intentional people build better lives. They make better decisions. They maintain healthier relationships. They preserve more energy. They carry less stress because they understand something many people never learn. Life is not determined by what happens to you. Life is largely determined by how you respond to what happens to you. Reaction is weakness. Response is power. Never forget that. The world will always give you reasons to react. There will always be criticism. There will always be delays. There will always be mistakes. There will always be difficult people. There will always be unexpected problems. The goal is not to eliminate those things. The goal is to stop allowing them to control you. That is the habit of staying calm while others fall apart. That is where emotional strength begins. That is where self-mastery starts. Practice it every day, in traffic, at work, at home, in conversations, in moments of frustration. Pause first, decide second. Because the person who learns to control their reactions eventually learns to control the direction of their life. And once you stop reacting to everything around you, you'll discover something even more important. Not all chaos begins inside your own mind. A great deal of it comes from the people around you. Their fear, their panic, their stress, their uncertainty. And if you're not careful, you'll start carrying emotions that never belonged to you in the first place. You have learned how to stop reacting. Now it's time to learn how to stop absorbing the chaos of others. Chapter 2. Your mind borrows chaos from others. Most people go through life believing that every emotion they feel belongs to them. But that's not entirely true. In fact, some of the emotions weighing on your mind today may have never started with you at all. Think about that for a moment. Every single day you move through a world filled with emotional signals: fear, stress, anxiety, frustration, anger, worry, panic. Whether you're aware of it or not, you're surrounded by these emotional currents all the time. They flow through workplaces, families, social circles, television screens, news reports, and social media feeds. And those emotions have a remarkable ability to travel from one person to another. That may not sound dangerous at first, but it is. In many ways, it is one of the most overlooked threats to emotional stability in modern life, because most people never notice it happening. They believe every feeling they experience originated within them. They believe every worry is their own worry. Every fear is their own fear. Every stress belongs to them. But often, what they're feeling has been picked up from the environment around them. That's the key. Not every emotion belongs to you. Let that sink in. Not every emotion belongs to you. Sometimes what you're carrying isn't yours at all. Have you ever walked into a room where something felt off? Nobody said anything. Nobody explained anything. Yet within seconds you could feel the tension. Maybe it was before a difficult meeting. Maybe it was during a family gathering where people weren't getting along. Maybe it was a waiting room, an airport, or even a crowded store during uncertain times. You could feel the nervousness in the air. The atmosphere seemed heavy. People looked uneasy. Conversations felt strained. And before long, you started feeling uneasy too. That's emotional contagion, the transfer of emotional energy from one person to another, and it happens far more often than most people realize. At work, at home, at church, at family gatherings, on social media, in communities, in entire nations. Human beings naturally influence one another. That can be positive, but it can also be dangerous, because many people spend years carrying emotional burdens that were never theirs to carry in the first place. Not every emotion belongs to you. Remember that. You have a choice. You can absorb the fear, or you can observe the fear, and those are two very different things. One leads to emotional dependence, the other leads to emotional freedom. Imagine a workplace during a difficult period. Business is slowing down. Management hasn't communicated clearly. Rumors begin circulating. One employee starts worrying. Another begins speculating. A third assumes the worst. Soon the break room conversations become darker. People start imagining layoffs. They start predicting disaster. Nobody actually knows what's going on. Yet anxiety spreads through the office like wildfire. Productivity drops, morale drops, confidence disappears. The emotional atmosphere changes completely. Why? Because fear spreads faster than facts. That's the key. Fear doesn't need evidence. Fear only needs exposure. People can become terrified of possibilities that don't even exist yet. And once enough people become afraid, the emotion begins feeding itself. One worried person influences another, then another, then another. Soon nobody is responding to reality anymore. They're responding to each other's fear. This is why calm people become incredibly valuable during difficult times. They refuse to borrow panic. They refuse to participate in emotional chaos. Instead of reacting, they ask questions. Instead of assuming, they investigate. Instead of spreading anxiety, they seek clarity. While everyone else is being driven by emotion, they remain anchored in reality. Not every emotion belongs to you. Never forget that. Now let's zoom out and look at a larger example. Financial markets. History has shown us the same pattern again and again. Fear appears. People panic. The crowd begins moving. Investors sell because other investors are selling. People rush because everyone else is rushing. Logic takes a back seat. Emotion takes the wheel. And suddenly, the crowd becomes stronger than reason. That's the danger of borrowed panic. One frightened person can influence 10 others. 10 can influence 100. 100 can influence thousands. And before long, entire groups are making decisions based on fear rather than facts. The crowd becomes the storm, and once that happens, clear thinking becomes rare. But this isn't just about money. It happens everywhere, especially today. Look at social media. One alarming headline appears. Someone reacts emotionally. Others react to that reaction. Then, more people react to those reactions. The cycle grows larger and larger. Before long, millions of people are emotionally invested in a situation they barely understand. Fear spreads, outrage spreads, stress spreads, panic spreads, and very few people stop long enough to ask a simple question. Is this emotion actually mine? That's the key. Most people never ask. They simply absorb. They absorb anxiety. They absorb outrage. They absorb fear. They absorb frustration. Then they mistake those borrowed emotions for personal truth. Not every emotion belongs to you. You have a choice. You can join the emotional crowd, or you can step back and think. Because crowds are often loud. But loud does not mean wise. Crowds are often confident, but confidence does not guarantee accuracy. Crowds are often emotional, but emotion does not create truth. That's why calm people have an advantage. They understand something many people forget. The crowd magnifies emotion. Distance creates wisdom. Distance creates perspective. Distance creates clarity. That's the key. Now let's talk about a skill that becomes more valuable with age and experience. Mental boundaries. Most people understand physical boundaries. They lock their doors at night. They protect their homes. They protect their possessions. They are careful about who enters their personal space, yet they leave their minds completely exposed. Anyone can influence them. Anyone can affect their mood. Anyone can disturb their emotional state. One angry conversation ruins an entire day. One fearful person destroys their confidence. One negative comment lingers in their mind for hours. Why? Because they never learned how to protect their inner world. Mental boundaries are not complicated. They simply require awareness. You can listen without absorbing. You can observe without attaching yourself emotionally. You can understand another person's feelings without becoming trapped inside those feelings. You remain compassionate, but you remain separate. This is not coldness. This is not selfishness. This is emotional maturity. It's not about ignoring reality. It's about protecting clarity. You have a choice. When someone arrives carrying panic, you do not have to carry it too. When someone arrives carrying fear, you do not have to adopt it as your own. When someone arrives carrying stress, you do not have to make that stress part of your identity. You can care about people without becoming overwhelmed by them. That's discipline, and discipline creates calm. The most emotionally resilient people in the world practice a simple habit over and over again. They separate facts from emotions. Whenever pressure rises, they ask, what do I actually know? What evidence exists? What assumptions am I making? What am I merely feeling? Those questions change everything, because facts create clarity. Emotions create movement, and movement without clarity often leads to mistakes. That's the key. Separate facts from feelings, separate evidence from assumptions, separate reality from imagination. That single habit can save you from years of unnecessary suffering. When others panic, ask for facts. When others exaggerate, ask for facts. When others predict disaster, ask for facts. Facts calm the mind. Emotion inflames it. Observe the storm without becoming the storm. Say it again. Observe the storm without becoming the storm. The storm may be happening around you. It does not have to happen inside you. The storm may exist in the workplace. It does not have to enter your thinking. The storm may dominate the news. It does not have to dominate your decisions. The storm may exist inside other people. It does not have to become your emotional reality. Observe the storm without becoming the storm. This is one of the habits that separates strong minds from fragile ones, leaders from followers, calm individuals from emotional crowds. Because the calmest person is not someone who avoids difficult situations. The calmest person is someone who remains centered while everyone else loses their center. And that is exactly what this audiobook is teaching you. To remain steady when others become unstable. To remain clear when others become confused, to remain grounded when others become overwhelmed. Not every emotion belongs to you. Never forget that. You are not responsible for carrying every fear you encounter. You are not obligated to inherit every anxiety around you. You are not required to join every emotional storm that passes through your life. You have a choice. Observe the storm without becoming the storm. Master this lesson, and your mind becomes stronger. Master this lesson and your judgment becomes wiser. Master this lesson and your peace becomes much harder to shake. But another challenge still remains. Even after you stop reacting impulsively, even after you stop borrowing the chaos of others, pressure will still arrive. Unexpected problems will still appear. And what you do during those first critical moments can determine everything that follows. You have learned how to protect your mind from outside chaos. Now it's time to learn how to control yourself when pressure first appears. And that begins with the next lesson. The first 5 minutes matter. Chapter 3. Control. The first 5 minutes. Most people think they lose control because of the crisis itself. But that's rarely what happens. In reality, they lose control long before the crisis has had a chance to unfold. They lose control in the beginning. In those first few moments, in those first few minutes, the moment the bad news arrives, the moment the unexpected problem appears, the moment life suddenly refuses to follow the plan. That is where the real battle begins, because the first few minutes after a setback are often the most dangerous. That is when fear is at its loudest. That is when emotions are competing for attention. That is when the mind is tempted to race ahead of reality, and that is when people are most likely to make decisions they later regret. The truth is surprisingly simple. The first moments after bad news often determine the direction of everything that follows. Not because the problem is solved immediately, not because the answer magically appears, but because your initial response creates momentum, and momentum is powerful. The first 5 minutes matter. Remember that. The first 5 minutes matter. Think back to the difficult moments in your own life. A phone call you never wanted to receive, a medical concern, a financial setback, a relationship problem, a mistake at work, an unexpected expense. Bad news rarely arrives with a warning. It simply appears. And when it does, most people react before they understand. They panic before they gather facts. They assume before they investigate. They worry before they think. They imagine disaster before they even know what is actually happening. And in doing so, they often create a second problem that is larger than the first. That's the key. The original problem is often manageable. The panic is what turns it into a disaster. The event creates difficulty. The reaction creates suffering. And the difference between the two is enormous. How many times have people made a situation worse simply because they couldn't control themselves during those first few moments? A rumor begins circulating. Immediately, people assume the worst. A misunderstanding occurs. Someone starts assigning blame. A challenge appears. The mind instantly jumps to failure. Within seconds, imagination takes over. And before reality has even had a chance to speak, fear has already written the story. That's what happens when emotions move faster than understanding. The first 5 minutes matter. You have a choice. You always have a choice. You can react emotionally, or you can respond intelligently. And that choice often arrives much faster than people realize. The phone rings. Bad news. A deal falls apart. A customer complains. An unexpected bill arrives in the mail. A loved one says something painful. A project begins to unravel after months of effort. In those moments, many people immediately lose perspective. Their thinking narrows, their breathing changes, their emotions begin taking command, and before long, they are fighting imaginary disasters instead of dealing with actual reality. That is why emotional discipline matters so much. Not after the crisis, not once everything settles down, at the very beginning, because beginnings shape endings. The first 5 minutes matter. Let's look at a business example. Imagine a company discovers a major issue with an important project. Deadlines are suddenly in danger. Clients are unhappy. Money may be lost. Pressure is building from every direction. One leader immediately panics. Their voice becomes sharp. Their patience disappears. They start blaming employees before understanding what happened. Angry emails are sent. Accusations are made. Everyone becomes defensive. The atmosphere changes. Communication breaks down. Small mistakes become larger mistakes. The original problem grows. Not because the challenge was impossible, because panic took control. Now imagine another leader facing the exact same situation, same project, same risk, same pressure, same potential consequences, but a completely different response. This leader takes a breath. They slow down. They ask questions before making assumptions. They gather information. They identify priorities. They focus on solutions instead of blame. And something remarkable happens. The team stays calmer. Communication improves, decisions become clearer, resources are used more effectively, and the outcome changes. Why? Because one person controlled the first 5 minutes. That's the key. The event was identical, the pressure was identical, but the response was different. And that difference changed everything. The first 5 minutes matter. Now, think about emergencies. When accidents happen, panic feels natural. Anyone can understand that. When something frightening occurs, emotion arrives instantly. Your heart races, your mind speeds up, your attention narrows. That response is human. But professionals understand something important. Panic rarely solves problems. Training does. Discipline does. Clarity does. When emergency responders arrive at an accident scene, they do not run blindly into chaos. They follow procedures. They gather information. They assess risks. They prioritize actions. They remain focused, not because they are fearless, not because they are immune to stress, but because they understand the cost of emotional reactions. It's not about fearlessness. It's about discipline. That is the difference. The calm individual is not someone who never feels fear. The calm individual is someone who refuses to let fear make decisions. Fear may enter the room, but fear does not get to run the meeting. You have a choice. Fear can speak, but fear does not get to drive. Stress can arrive, but stress does not get to lead. Emotion can appear, but emotion does not get the final vote. That's the key. You remain in control, even when circumstances are difficult, even when pressure is real. Even when uncertainty exists, the first 5 minutes matter. One of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming that speed always equals effectiveness. It doesn't. Sometimes speed creates damage. Sometimes rushing creates confusion. Sometimes acting immediately creates consequences that cannot be undone. In fact, some of the most expensive mistakes in life happen because someone moved too quickly. They spoke too quickly, decided too quickly, reacted too quickly. That's why slowing down is often the fastest way forward. Think about that. Slowing down is often the fastest way forward because slowing down prevents mistakes. Slowing down improves judgment. Slowing down creates perspective. And perspective creates better decisions. The strongest people understand that calmness is not hesitation. Calmness is preparation. The people who consistently make good decisions have learned a powerful habit. When bad news arrives, they do not immediately ask, "What should I do?" Instead, they ask, "What do I need to understand?" That single question changes everything. Because understanding comes before action, clarity comes before movement, wisdom comes before decisions. That's the key. Understand first, act later. Repeat it. Understand first, act later. I'll rewrite Chapter 4 in the same more natural human audiobook style as the previous chapters, while preserving the full message and strengthening the emotional flow. Chapter 4. Separate facts from fear. Most people believe they are suffering because of reality. But if they were completely honest with themselves, they would discover something surprising. Much of their suffering is not coming from reality at all. It's coming from imagination. Read that again. Much of what keeps people awake at night isn't what is happening. It's what they think might happen. It's not the event itself. It's the story surrounding the event. And that distinction can change your entire life. Most people are not suffering because of reality. They are suffering because of imagination. That may sound harsh at first. You may even feel resistance to the idea, but take a moment and think about your own life. How many things have you worried about that never happened? How many sleepless nights were spent preparing for disasters that never arrived? How many conversations did you rehearse in your head that never took place? How many times did you convince yourself that the worst-case scenario was coming, only to discover later that things worked out far better than you expected? If you're like most people, the answer is probably more times than you can count. That's because the human mind has a tendency to create stories. And unfortunately, fear is often the author. A surprising amount of anxiety comes from events that never happen. A surprising amount of stress comes from problems that never arrive. A surprising amount of emotional suffering comes from scenarios that exist only in the imagination. Yet those imagined scenarios feel real. That's the danger. The body does not always know the difference between a real threat and a vividly imagined one. Think about what happens when you spend hours worrying about something terrible. Your heart starts beating faster, your shoulders become tense, your breathing changes, your focus narrows, your energy begins to drain away, your sleep suffers, your mood changes. Nothing has happened, and yet your body reacts as if the danger is already standing in front of you. That's the power of fear, and that's why fear can become so destructive. Fear creates stories that facts cannot support. Facts first, feelings second. Remember that. Facts first, feelings second. The calmest people are not calm because their lives are easier. They are not calm because they never experience uncertainty. They are calm because they refuse to confuse assumptions with reality. Most people do exactly the opposite. They take a small piece of information and build an entire emotional universe around it. One unanswered text message becomes rejection. One delayed phone call becomes bad news. One mistake at work becomes career disaster. One difficult month financially becomes permanent failure. One uncomfortable conversation becomes the end of a relationship. Nothing has actually happened. Nothing has been confirmed. No evidence exists. Yet emotionally, the catastrophe already feels real. Why? Because fear is an excellent storyteller. Fear can take a tiny fact and build an enormous fiction around it. Fear whispers questions into your mind. What if this gets worse? What if everything falls apart? What if I fail? What if they leave? What if I never recover? What if I lose everything? And before long, the mind begins constructing scenes, entire futures, entire disasters, entire tragedies. Then, something remarkable happens. The mind starts believing the stories it created, and once it believes them, it begins suffering because of them. That's the key. Fear speaks in possibilities. Facts speak in realities. You have a choice. You can listen to fear, or you can investigate reality. Most people never learn the difference. Let's talk about relationships, because this is one of the places where fear does its best work. Someone you care about seems distant. Maybe they're busy. Maybe they're exhausted. Maybe they're dealing with something difficult that has nothing to do with you. But fear immediately steps forward and begins writing a script. They're losing interest. They're upset with me. They don't care anymore. The relationship is falling apart. Notice what happened. No conversation, no evidence, no confirmation, just assumptions. Yet those assumptions create very real emotional pain. The person starts overthinking. They replay conversations. They analyze messages. They search for hidden meanings. They create explanations that may have no connection to reality at all. And soon, they are emotionally reacting to a problem that may not even exist. Facts first, feelings second. That's the discipline. The fact is simple. Someone seemed distant. Everything else is a story. Return to the facts. Now, let's talk about money. This is where fear becomes incredibly persuasive. A bill arrives unexpectedly. A repair is needed. Business slows down. The market changes. Income decreases. Immediately, fear begins talking. What if I can't recover? What if things get worse? What if everything I've worked for disappears? Again, notice the pattern. The mind leaps beyond reality. It races into a future that has not happened. And often that imagined future is far worse than the actual situation. The result? Stress, sleepless nights, poor judgment, emotional decisions. People become so afraid of what might happen that they begin damaging what is happening. That's the cost of imagined catastrophes. The problem may be difficult. The fear makes it feel impossible. The challenge may be manageable. The fear makes it feel overwhelming. Facts first, feelings second. Return to the facts. Now consider your career. You receive difficult feedback. A project struggles. A promotion goes to someone else. A client leaves. Business slows down. Immediately, the mind begins creating explanations. My career is over. I'll never succeed. I'm falling behind. Everyone else is moving ahead while I'm stuck. The emotional reaction becomes larger than the actual event. And that's where suffering begins. Not in reality, in interpretation, not in facts, in assumptions. That's the key. People rarely suffer from reality alone. They suffer from the meaning they attach to reality. And when fear controls the meaning, clarity disappears. You have a choice. You can believe every thought that enters your mind, or you can challenge it. The strongest minds do not automatically trust every fearful thought. They question it, they examine it, they test it. Because not every thought deserves belief, and not every fear deserves your attention. This is where one of the most powerful habits in life begins. Questioning. Most people never question their fears. They obey them. A fearful thought appears. They accept it. An anxious prediction appears. They believe it. A negative assumption appears. They treat it like truth. But calm people do something different. They ask questions, simple questions, powerful questions, life-changing questions. What is true? What is assumed? What is true? What is assumed? Those two questions alone can transform your thinking. Imagine you're worried about losing your job. Stop for a moment and ask yourself, what is true? Perhaps business is slower. Perhaps revenue is down. Perhaps changes are happening. Those are facts. Now ask, what is assumed? Maybe you're assuming layoffs are coming. Maybe you're assuming you'll be affected. Maybe you're assuming disaster is inevitable. Those are assumptions. Notice the difference. Facts are evidence. Assumptions are predictions. Facts are reality. Assumptions are stories. Return to the facts. Again and again. Return to the facts. Whenever anxiety begins rising, ask yourself, what do I actually know? What evidence exists? What am I adding to this story? What am I imagining? The answers often reveal something remarkable. Most fear is built on uncertainty, not reality. And uncertainty is not the same thing as danger. That's the key. Many people confuse uncertainty with catastrophe. Because they don't know what will happen, they assume something terrible will happen. But uncertainty simply means you don't know. Nothing more, nothing less. The future has not been written yet. You have a choice. You can fill uncertainty with fear, or you can fill uncertainty with patience. The calm person chooses patience. The calm person waits for evidence. The calm person refuses to build emotional prisons from imaginary futures because they understand something powerful. Reality is usually far more manageable than fear predicts. Think back 5 years. Remember the situations that once felt overwhelming, the problems that kept you awake, the worries that dominated your thoughts. Many of them never happened. Some disappeared completely. Others were resolved. Others became valuable lessons that strengthened you. Yet at the time, the fear felt real. That's because fear specializes in exaggeration. Facts specialize in clarity. Facts first, feelings second. Never forget that. When fear begins telling stories, return to the facts. When anxiety starts predicting disaster, return to the facts. When your imagination starts racing ahead of reality, return to the facts. Because facts anchor you, facts steady you. Facts protect you from emotional illusions. And emotional illusions are one of the greatest enemies of peace. The ability to separate facts from fear is the ability to reclaim your mind. It is the ability to see clearly when others become overwhelmed. It is the ability to stay grounded when others become trapped inside stories they created themselves. That is how you remain calm while others fall apart. Not by denying fear, not by pretending fear doesn't exist, but by refusing to allow fear to replace reality. Return to the facts, always. Because once you learn to separate reality from imagination, something extraordinary begins to happen. The noise starts fading, the panic begins to settle, the rushing slows down. And in that quiet space, a new kind of strength begins to emerge. Stillness. You have learned to separate facts from fear. Now it's time to discover why stillness may be one of the greatest advantages a human being can possess. Chapter 6. Stop feeding the drama. One of the biggest reasons people lose their peace has nothing to do with bad luck. Nothing to do with difficult circumstances. Nothing to do with a lack of opportunity. It has everything to do with what they choose to feed. Most people believe they want peace, but their daily actions tell a different story. They say they want calmness, yet they consume chaos. They say they want stability, yet they chase emotional excitement. They say they want less stress, yet they repeatedly invite stress into their lives. That's the key. Many people are not victims of drama. They are participants in it. Sometimes they are even addicted to it. That may sound uncomfortable. Good. Truth is often uncomfortable, because transformation begins where excuses end. Many people unconsciously seek emotional stimulation, not because it improves their lives, because it makes them feel something, anything. Excitement, outrage, conflict, tension, validation. Drama becomes entertainment. Drama becomes habit. Drama becomes identity. And eventually, drama becomes addiction. Do not feed what you want to starve. Repeat that. Do not feed what you want to starve. If you want peace, stop feeding chaos. If you want calmness, stop feeding conflict. If you want stability, stop feeding emotional disorder. The principle is simple. Whatever you repeatedly feed grows stronger. Whatever you repeatedly starve grows weaker. That's true for confidence. It's true for fear. It's true for discipline. And it is absolutely true for drama. Do not feed what you want to starve. Look at how many people start their day. Before they even think clearly, they begin consuming emotional noise, negative headlines, angry opinions, online arguments, public outrage, endless controversy. Within minutes, their emotional state has been hijacked, their attention is scattered. Their focus is weakened, their mood is influenced, and they haven't even left the house. Then they wonder why they feel overwhelmed. The answer is simple. They are feeding chaos. That's the key. What enters your mind eventually shapes your mind. You have a choice. You can consume peace, or you can consume conflict. You can consume clarity, or you can consume confusion. Every choice matters, every day. Now let's talk about gossip. Few things destroy peace faster than unnecessary gossip. Why? Because gossip teaches the mind to focus on problems instead of solutions. It trains attention toward negativity. It trains attention toward judgment. It trains attention toward other people's mistakes. And every minute spent discussing someone else's life is a minute not invested in improving your own. Yet many people spend hours every week participating in conversations that add no value whatsoever. They know the latest rumors, they know the latest scandals, they know the latest conflicts, but they do not know themselves. That's the tragedy. They are experts on other people and strangers to their own potential. You don't need their permission to leave those conversations. You don't need their approval to walk away from negativity. You don't need the crowd's agreement to protect your peace. That's the key. Maturity often looks like losing interest in drama. Now let's talk about outrage. Modern culture profits from outrage. The more emotional people become, the more attention they give. And attention is valuable. So every day, countless systems compete for your emotional energy. They want your anger. They want your frustration. They want your reaction. Because reaction keeps you engaged. Reaction keeps you distracted. Reaction keeps you consuming. But calm people recognize the trap. They understand that not every issue deserves emotional investment. Not every controversy deserves attention. Not every argument deserves participation. You have a choice. You do not need to react to everything. You do not need to have an opinion on everything. You do not need to join every emotional battle that appears on your screen. That's the key. Attention is a resource. Spend it carefully. Because wherever attention goes, energy follows, and wherever energy goes, life follows. Protect your energy. Remember that. Protect your energy. Now let's talk about conflict. Some people spend their entire lives searching for fights, not physical fights, emotional fights, arguments, disagreements, power struggles. They need to be right. They need to win. They need to prove themselves. Every disagreement becomes a battlefield. Every criticism becomes a threat. Every challenge becomes personal. And the result is predictable. Exhaustion. Because conflict consumes energy. It consumes focus. It consumes peace. And most of the time, it produces very little in return. It's not about being right. It's about discipline. It's not about winning every argument. It's about choosing which arguments deserve your attention. That's a completely different mindset. Wise people understand that some victories are too expensive. You win the argument, but lose your peace. You prove your point, but lose your focus. You dominate the conversation, but waste your energy. Was it worth it? Often, the answer is no. Protect your energy. One of the most powerful habits you can develop is selective engagement. Not every battle is your battle. Not every problem is your responsibility. Not every conflict requires your involvement. This requires discipline. Because the ego wants participation. The ego wants recognition. The ego wants validation. But calmness requires restraint. The ability to say no. The ability to walk away. The ability to remain silent. The ability to let something go. That's strength, not weakness. Strength. You have a choice. You can continue giving attention to every distraction, or you can become intentional. You can continue reacting to every emotional trigger, or you can protect your focus. The choice is always yours. Peace grows where attention goes. Repeat that. Peace grows where attention goes. Most people believe peace is something they find. It isn't. Peace is something they create through daily choices, through disciplined attention, through emotional responsibility. That's the key. You are responsible for what you allow into your mind. You are responsible for what you repeatedly focus on. You are responsible for what you repeatedly feed. No one else, not your coworkers, not social media, not the news, not difficult people. You. Personal responsibility is where emotional freedom begins. The moment you stop blaming the world for your emotional state, you regain power. Because power follows responsibility, and responsibility creates change. Do not feed what you want to starve. If you want less anxiety, stop feeding anxious habits. If you want less conflict, stop feeding conflict. If you want more peace, start feeding peace. Read better things, listen to better things, think about better things, spend time with better influences. Create environments that strengthen calmness instead of destroying it. Protect your energy. Because energy is not unlimited. Every unnecessary argument costs something. Every unnecessary worry costs something. Every unnecessary drama costs something. And over time, those costs become enormous. The calmest people are not calm by accident. They are selective. They guard their attention. They guard their focus. They guard their emotional resources. They understand that peace requires protection. That's the key. The goal is not to hide from life. The goal is to stop volunteering for unnecessary suffering. The goal is not to avoid responsibility. The goal is to avoid distraction. And distraction often arrives disguised as drama. You have learned how to stop feeding emotional chaos. You have learned how to protect your attention. You have learned how to guard your peace. These habits make it easier to remain calm while others fall apart. But there is one more truth you must understand. When real pressure arrives, your calmness will not come from good intentions. It will come from preparation. Because nobody becomes calm during a crisis unless they practiced calmness before the crisis. You have stopped feeding the drama. Now it's time to build the discipline that allows calmness to survive under pressure. I'll rewrite Chapter 6 in the same natural human audiobook style, keeping all ideas intact while making the emotional flow deeper, more relatable, and more engaging for long-form listening. Chapter 6. Stop feeding the drama. One of the biggest reasons people lose their peace has very little to do with bad luck. It has very little to do with difficult circumstances, and it often has nothing to do with a lack of opportunity. More often than not, it comes down to something much simpler. It comes down to what they choose to feed every day. Think about that for a moment. Every day, whether you realize it or not, you are feeding something. You are feeding certain thoughts, certain habits, certain emotions, certain patterns of attention, and whatever you consistently feed will eventually grow stronger. Most people say they want peace. But if you look closely at their daily behavior, a different story begins to emerge. They say they want calmness. Yet they spend hours consuming chaos. They say they want emotional stability, yet they chase emotional excitement wherever they can find it. They say they want less stress, yet they repeatedly invite stress into their lives through their habits, conversations, and choices. That's the key. Many people are not victims of drama, they are participants in it, and sometimes, without realizing it, they become dependent on it. That may feel uncomfortable to hear. Good. Because growth often begins with uncomfortable truths. Transformation starts where excuses end. The reality is that many people unconsciously seek emotional stimulation, not because it improves their lives, not because it helps them grow, but because it makes them feel something, anything. Excitement, outrage, conflict, validation, tension, a rush of emotion. For some people, drama becomes entertainment. For others, it becomes routine. And for many, it slowly becomes part of their identity. Eventually, drama stops being something that happens to them. It becomes something they repeatedly seek. That's when it becomes dangerous, because anything repeated often enough can become an addiction. Do not feed what you want to starve. Remember that. Do not feed what you want to starve. If you want peace, stop feeding chaos. If you want calmness, stop feeding conflict. If you want emotional stability, stop feeding emotional disorder. The principle is simple. Whatever you repeatedly feed becomes stronger. Whatever you repeatedly starve becomes weaker. That is true for confidence. It is true for fear. It is true for discipline. And it is absolutely true for drama. Do not feed what you want to starve. Look at how many people begin their mornings. Before they even have a chance to think clearly, they reach for a screen. Before they have a chance to center themselves, they begin consuming noise, negative headlines, angry opinions, political arguments, online conflicts, outrage, controversy, fear. Within minutes, their emotional state has been influenced by people they have never met. Their focus is scattered, their mood changes, their attention becomes fragmented, and they haven't even finished their morning coffee. Then they wonder why they feel anxious, why they feel distracted, why they feel mentally exhausted before the day has even begun. The answer is often right in front of them. They are feeding chaos. That's the key. What repeatedly enters your mind eventually shapes your mind. You have a choice. You can consume peace, or you can consume conflict. You can feed clarity, or you can feed confusion. You can strengthen your focus, or you can weaken it. Every choice matters, every day, because small choices repeated consistently become powerful habits. Now let's talk about gossip. Few habits quietly destroy peace as effectively as gossip. Why? Because gossip trains the mind to focus on problems instead of solutions. It trains attention toward criticism, toward judgment, toward negativity, toward the lives of other people. Think about how much time people spend discussing someone else's mistakes, someone else's relationships, someone else's failures, someone else's drama, hours, days, years. And at the end of it all, very little has improved. Yet many people can tell you everything happening in someone else's life. They know the latest rumor, the latest scandal, the latest conflict, the latest controversy. But they struggle to answer a much more important question. Who are they becoming? That's the tragedy. They become experts on other people while remaining strangers to their own potential. You don't need their permission to leave those conversations. You don't need their approval to step away from negativity. You don't need the crowd's agreement to protect your peace. That's the key. Maturity often looks like losing interest in unnecessary drama, not because you're better than anyone else, but because you finally realized the cost. Now let's talk about outrage. Because outrage has become one of the most profitable products in the modern world. Entire industries are built around capturing your attention through emotion. The more emotional people become, the longer they stay engaged. The longer they stay engaged, the more valuable their attention becomes. So every day, countless systems compete for your emotional energy. They want your anger. They want your frustration. They want your outrage. They want your reaction. Because reaction keeps you watching, reaction keeps you scrolling, reaction keeps you consuming. But calm people recognize the trap. They understand that not every issue deserves emotional investment, not every controversy deserves their attention, not every argument deserves their participation. You have a choice. You do not need to react to everything. You do not need to have an opinion about everything. You do not need to involve yourself in every emotional battle that appears on your screen. That's the key. Attention is one of the most valuable resources you possess. Spend it carefully, because wherever your attention goes, your energy follows. And wherever your energy goes, your life follows. Protect your energy. Remember that. Protect your energy. Now let's talk about conflict. Some people spend their entire lives looking for battles, not physical battles, emotional battles, arguments, power struggles, competition, the need to prove themselves, the need to be right, the need to win. Every disagreement becomes a contest. Every criticism becomes an attack. Every challenge becomes personal. And the result is almost always the same: exhaustion. Because conflict consumes energy, it consumes focus, it consumes emotional resources, and in most cases, it offers very little in return. It's not about being right. It's about discipline. It's not about winning every argument. It's about deciding which arguments deserve your energy. That is a completely different mindset. Wise people understand something many people never learn. Some victories are simply too expensive. You win the argument, but lose your peace. You prove your point, but lose your focus. You dominate the conversation, but sacrifice your emotional energy. Was it worth it? Often the answer is no. Protect your energy. One of the most powerful habits you can develop is selective engagement. Not every battle belongs to you. Not every problem requires your involvement. Not every conflict deserves your attention. This requires discipline. Because the ego wants participation. The ego wants recognition. The ego wants validation. The ego wants to be seen as right. But calmness requires something different: restraint, the ability to say no, the ability to walk away, the ability to remain silent when silence serves you better, the ability to let things go. That is not weakness. That is strength, real strength. You have a choice. You can continue giving attention to every distraction that appears. Or you can become intentional. You can continue reacting to every emotional trigger. Or you can protect your focus. You can continue feeding chaos. Or you can begin feeding peace. The choice is always yours. Peace grows where attention goes. Remember that. Peace grows where attention goes. Most people think peace is something they find somewhere outside themselves. But peace is rarely found. Peace is created. It is built. One decision at a time. One habit at a time. One disciplined choice at a time. That's the key. You are responsible for what you allow into your mind. You are responsible for what you repeatedly focus on. You are responsible for what you repeatedly feed. No one else, not your coworkers, not social media, not the news, not difficult people. You. Personal responsibility is where emotional freedom begins. The moment you stop blaming the world for your emotional state, you regain power. Because power follows responsibility. And responsibility creates change. Do not feed what you want to starve. If you want less anxiety, stop feeding anxious habits. If you want less conflict, stop feeding conflict. If you want less chaos, stop feeding chaos. If you want more peace, begin feeding peace. Read things that strengthen your thinking. Listen to voices that strengthen your character. Spend time with people who elevate your mindset. Create environments that support calmness instead of destroying it. Protect your energy, because energy is not unlimited. Every unnecessary argument costs something. Every unnecessary worry costs something. Every unnecessary drama costs something. And those costs accumulate day after day, year after year, until people wake up wondering where all their peace went. The calmest people are not calm by accident. They are selective. They guard their attention. They guard their focus. They guard their emotional resources. They understand that peace requires protection. That's the key. The goal is not to hide from life. The goal is to stop volunteering for unnecessary suffering. The goal is not to avoid responsibility. The goal is to avoid distraction. And distraction often arrives disguised as drama. You have learned how to stop feeding emotional chaos. You have learned how to protect your attention. You have learned how to guard your peace. And these habits make it easier to remain calm while others fall apart. But there is still one more truth you must understand. When real pressure arrives, calmness will not come from good intentions. It will not come from wishful thinking. It will not come from hoping you stay composed. It will come from preparation. Because nobody suddenly becomes calm during a crisis. They become calm because they practiced calmness long before the crisis arrived. You have stopped feeding the drama. Now it's time to build the discipline that allows calmness to survive under pressure. I'll rewrite Chapter 7 in the same humanized audiobook style, keeping the original structure and lessons intact while making the narration feel more natural, emotionally resonant, and engaging for long-form listening. Chapter 7. Train yourself before the crisis arrives. One of the biggest misunderstandings people have about calmness is believing it will magically appear when they need it most. They imagine that when pressure arrives, something inside them will suddenly activate, that somehow they will become stronger, more disciplined, more focused, more emotionally steady. They assume that when the crisis comes, they will naturally know what to do. But life rarely works that way. Pressure does not create character. Pressure reveals character. Pressure does not create discipline. Pressure exposes the discipline that already exists. Pressure does not create calmness. Pressure reveals whether calmness was built long before the pressure arrived. That's the key. You do not rise to the occasion, you fall to your training. Remember that. You do not rise to the occasion, you fall to your training. When life suddenly becomes difficult, there is no time to build new habits. There is no time to develop emotional control from scratch. There is no time to learn discipline for the first time. In those moments, something else takes over. Your habits take over. Your routines take over. Your conditioning takes over. The patterns you have repeated for months and years begin running automatically. That is why preparation matters so much. Most people wait until life becomes difficult before they decide to become stronger. They wait until stress appears before they try to become calm. They wait until adversity arrives before they start developing discipline. Unfortunately, that approach rarely succeeds. Because strength is not built during the storm. Strength is built before the storm ever arrives. Calmness is not created during pressure. It is created long before pressure appears. You have a choice. You can prepare now, or you can be forced to learn during the crisis. And learning during the crisis is always more expensive. The people who remain calm while others fall apart are usually not extraordinary people. They are prepared people. That's the difference. Let's look at sports. Imagine an athlete standing in the final moments of a championship game. The crowd is roaring, the pressure is overwhelming. Millions of people are watching. Everything seems to depend on a single moment. From the outside, it looks like confidence. It looks like natural talent. It looks like someone who was simply born for the occasion. But what most people never see is everything that came before that moment. The early mornings, the exhausting practices, the repetition. The sacrifices, the discipline, the thousands of hours nobody applauded. The athlete remains calm because the moment is familiar, not because the pressure disappeared, because they have trained for it. Their body has been trained, their mind has been trained, their emotions have been trained. They are not relying on hope, they are relying on preparation. You do not rise to the occasion, you fall to your training. The same principle exists everywhere in life. Think about firefighters, paramedics, emergency responders, rescue workers. When a crisis unfolds, chaos surrounds them. People panic, people freeze, people become emotional, people lose perspective. Yet trained professionals often remain remarkably composed. Why? Not because they don't feel fear, not because they don't feel stress, but because they have rehearsed difficult situations again and again. They have practiced under pressure. They have repeated critical procedures until those actions became automatic. They have conditioned themselves to remain effective when everyone else becomes overwhelmed. That's the key. Training replaces panic. Preparation replaces confusion. Discipline replaces fear. It's not about courage alone. It's about conditioning. Now, think about military preparation. Military organizations understand something most people overlook. A crisis is the worst possible time to begin learning. That is why training happens long before combat ever begins. Skills are repeated, procedures are practiced, responses are rehearsed again and again and again. Why? Because under pressure, people rarely perform above their level of preparation. They perform at it. You do not rise to the occasion. You fall to your training. This principle applies just as much to emotional control. Most people believe emotional stability is something you're born with, a personality trait, a natural gift. But that's not true. Emotional stability is a habit, and habits can be trained. Every day, whether you realize it or not, you are training your mind. Every reaction strengthens a pattern. Every response strengthens a pattern. Every decision strengthens a pattern. Every repeated behavior becomes part of who you are. That's why daily behavior matters. The way you handle small frustrations today influences how you'll handle major frustrations tomorrow. The way you deal with inconvenience today shapes how you'll respond to adversity later. The way you manage stress right now determines how you'll respond when greater pressure arrives. It's not about intensity, it's about consistency. That's the key. Small moments matter. Many people dream of having extraordinary calmness during extraordinary situations, but they ignore the ordinary opportunities to practice calmness every single day. They lose their patience in traffic. They become irritated by long lines. They complain about minor inconveniences. They react emotionally to small frustrations. Then they expect emotional mastery when a major challenge arrives. Life doesn't work that way. Discipline grows through repetition. Calmness grows through repetition. Emotional strength grows through repetition. Train calm daily. Remember that. Train calm daily. If you want calmness under pressure, practice calmness when pressure is low. That is how emotional resilience is built. Now, let's make this practical. How do you train calm daily? Start with your reactions. The next time something small goes wrong, pay attention. Maybe someone cuts you off in traffic. Maybe a meeting gets delayed. Maybe a package arrives late. Maybe someone says something irritating. Pause. Observe your reaction. Choose discipline, not because the event matters, because the habit matters. Every small victory strengthens emotional control. Train calm daily. Next, practice patience. This may sound simple, but it is incredibly powerful. Most people have become uncomfortable with waiting. They want answers immediately, results immediately, solutions immediately. They want life to move at the speed of their expectations. But patience is a form of emotional training. Every time you wait without frustration, you strengthen your ability to remain calm. Every time you accept delay without anger, you strengthen discipline. That's the key. Patience is preparation. Now consider controlled breathing. Simple, practical, powerful. When stress appears, slow your breathing. Not because breathing magically solves problems, but because breathing changes your state. And your state influences your decisions. A calm body supports a calm mind. Train calm daily. Another valuable practice is intentional silence. Not every thought requires expression. Not every emotion requires discussion. Not every irritation deserves a response. Sometimes the most powerful action is restraint. Sometimes the strongest response is no response. Every time you choose discipline over impulsiveness, you strengthen emotional control. This is not suppression. This is mastery. Train calm daily. You can also train perspective. When a problem appears, ask yourself, will this matter in a week? Will this matter in a month? Will this matter in a year? Many frustrations lose their power the moment they are viewed from a wider perspective. Most people magnify problems. Disciplined people evaluate them. That's the difference. Perspective creates stability. Stability creates calmness. Calmness creates strength. Train calm daily. The goal is not perfection. The goal is preparation. You are not trying to become emotionless. You are trying to become dependable. Dependable under pressure. Dependable during uncertainty. Dependable when life becomes difficult. Because that is what calmness truly is. Reliability, the ability to remain steady regardless of circumstances. You have a choice. You can allow emotions to control your behavior, or you can train yourself to control your emotions. One path leads to instability. The other leads to strength. And that decision is not made once. It is made daily. That's why small disciplines matter so much. Most people underestimate small disciplines because the rewards are not immediate. The results do not appear overnight. But small disciplines create extraordinary stability over time. One calm response, one patient moment, one controlled reaction, one thoughtful decision. Repeated over months and years, those small actions transform a person. The calmest people are rarely born calm. They become calm through training. They spend years building habits that support emotional stability. They create systems, practices, routines, disciplines. And when pressure arrives, those disciplines protect them. You do not rise to the occasion. You fall to your training. Never forget that. Because when life becomes difficult, preparation becomes visible. When chaos appears, discipline becomes visible. When pressure arrives, training becomes visible. And that training determines whether you remain steady or fall apart. Train calm daily. The future version of yourself is depending on it. Every moment of discipline today becomes emotional strength tomorrow. Every moment of preparation today becomes stability tomorrow. Every moment of calmness today becomes confidence tomorrow. That is how you become the person who remains steady while others become overwhelmed. But there is another lesson waiting for you. even with preparation, even with discipline, even with emotional training. Much of your anxiety will remain if you continue trying to control things that were never yours to control. You have trained yourself before the crisis arrives. Now it's time to learn where your energy truly belongs. I'll rewrite Chapter 8 in the same natural, emotionally engaging audiobook style, preserving every core idea while making it feel more human, reflective, and comfortable for long-form listening. Chapter 8. Detach from what you cannot control. One of the quickest ways to lose your peace is to spend your life fighting battles that were never yours to win. Not because you're lazy, not because you're weak, not because you lack intelligence, determination, or effort, but because you're trying to control things that have never been under your control in the first place. And this is where a tremendous amount of human anxiety begins. People exhaust themselves trying to manage outcomes they cannot guarantee. They try to manage other people's decisions, other people's opinions, other people's emotions. They try to manage the future, the economy, unexpected circumstances, things that exist far beyond their reach. And the harder they try to control those things, the more frustrated they become. The more frustrated they become, the more exhausted they feel. The more exhausted they feel, the more peace slips away. That's the key. A large portion of anxiety comes from trying to control what was never yours to control. Think about your own life. How much emotional energy has been spent worrying about things you could not directly change? The opinions of other people, the choices other people make, the future, the market, politics, the weather, unexpected setbacks, life's uncertainties. If we're honest, probably more than we'd like to admit. Many people walk through life carrying responsibilities that do not belong to them. And eventually, that weight becomes overwhelming. Focus on what is yours. Remember that. Focus on what is yours. This may be one of the most valuable distinctions you ever learn. The difference between influence and control. Many people confuse the two. Because they can influence something, they assume they should be able to control it. But those are very different things. You may influence people, but you cannot control them. You may influence opportunities, but you cannot force them. You may influence outcomes, but you cannot guarantee them. You may influence a situation, but you cannot dictate every result. That's the key. Influence allows effort. Control guarantees outcomes, and very little in life offers guaranteed outcomes. You have a choice. You can spend your life arguing with reality, or you can learn to work with reality. One path creates endless frustration. The other creates peace. Let's look at politics for a moment. Every day, millions of people become emotionally consumed by events happening far beyond their personal influence. They watch the news, they scroll through headlines, they argue online, they complain, they worry, they become angry. And before long, their emotional state rises and falls based on events they cannot personally change. Entire days are ruined, relationships become strained, conversations become hostile. Energy becomes depleted. Yet after all that emotional investment, very little changes. The event continues, life continues, the stress remains. Why? Because attention was invested where personal control did not exist. That's the key. Attention without influence often creates frustration. Focus on what is yours. Now think about financial markets. This is another place where people often surrender their peace. Prices rise, prices fall, predictions change, experts disagree. Uncertainty appears, and many people allow their emotions to follow every movement. One day they feel optimistic, the next day they feel fearful, then hopeful, then worried, then hopeful again. Their peace becomes tied to conditions they cannot control. That is emotional slavery. Not because markets are bad, but because dependence is dangerous. Calm people approach things differently. They focus on what belongs to them, their preparation, their discipline, their habits, their decisions, their response, because those things are within their control. The outcome may not be. The effort is. Focus on what is yours. Now let's discuss one of the most common traps of all: other people's opinions. Entire lives have been shaped by the fear of what someone else might think. People change their behavior, hide their dreams, suppress their voice, abandon their goals, all because they want approval, validation, acceptance, recognition. And because that desire becomes so powerful, they become trapped by it. Every criticism feels personal. Every judgment feels significant. Every negative opinion feels like a threat. But here's a truth that can set you free. You cannot control how people think. You cannot control how people interpret you. You cannot control how people judge you. And you never could. That's the key. The desire for universal approval is a battle nobody wins. Someone will misunderstand you. Someone will disagree with you. Someone will criticize you, no matter how carefully you live. You don't need their permission to live according to your values. You don't need their permission to pursue meaningful goals. You don't need their permission to remain calm. The moment you stop trying to manage everyone else's opinion is the moment you reclaim your freedom. Because freedom begins where unnecessary control ends. Focus on what is yours. Now let's talk about acceptance. Many people misunderstand this word. They hear acceptance and assume weakness. They hear acceptance and imagine surrender. They hear acceptance and think it means giving up. But that is not what acceptance means at all. Acceptance is simply the willingness to acknowledge reality, nothing more, nothing less. Acceptance means seeing clearly, without denial, without resistance, without emotional argument. The rain is falling. Accept it. The traffic is heavy. Accept it. The past happened. Accept it. Someone made a decision you dislike. Accept it. Acceptance does not mean approval. Acceptance means recognition. That's the key. You cannot respond effectively to reality until you first acknowledge reality. It's not about surrender. It's about discipline. It's not about giving up. It's about clarity. You have a choice. You can resist reality, or you can work with it. One creates suffering. The other creates strength. Acceptance is strength, because acceptance frees energy. Energy that was previously wasted arguing with what already exists. Energy that can now be directed toward meaningful action, and meaningful action is where your power lives. Focus on what is yours. This brings us to practical detachment, and practical detachment is often misunderstood. It does not mean becoming cold. It does not mean becoming indifferent. It does not mean you stop caring. In fact, it means the opposite. It means caring wisely. It means investing emotional energy where it can actually make a difference. Most people become attached to outcomes, specific results, specific timelines, specific expectations. And when life unfolds differently than they hoped, they suffer. Not because effort failed, but because attachment created unnecessary pain. That's the key. The attachment often hurts more than the event itself. Imagine applying for a job. You prepare thoroughly. You show up ready. You do your best. You give the interview everything you have. Then the decision is made. At that point, what remains within your control? Nothing. The interview is over. The preparation is complete. The effort has been given. Yet many people continue suffering because they remain emotionally attached to the result. Calm people operate differently. They commit fully to the process. Then they release the outcome because they understand something powerful. Effort belongs to them. Outcome does not. Release the outcome. Control the effort. Say it again. Release the outcome. Control the effort. This principle applies almost everywhere in life. Relationships, business, health, personal goals, parenting, leadership. You control your effort. You control your attitude. You control your preparation. You control your behavior. The rest belongs to life. The rest belongs to reality. The rest belongs to factors larger than yourself. And there is tremendous peace in accepting that truth. You have a choice. You can spend your life chasing control, or you can focus on responsibility. Responsibility creates power. Control often creates frustration. That's the key. The moment you stop trying to control everything, you often become more effective, not less, because your energy becomes concentrated, focused, directed, purposeful. Instead of scattered across endless worries and imagined scenarios, Focus on what is yours, release the outcome, control the effort. Master those two principles and anxiety begins losing its grip. Because anxiety thrives in uncertainty, but discipline thrives in responsibility, and responsibility is always available. No matter what happens, no matter what changes, no matter what challenges appear, there is always something within your control, your response, your effort, your mindset, your preparation, your discipline. That is where your attention belongs. That is where your power lives. That is how you remain calm while others fall apart, not by controlling everything, but by mastering what is yours. And something remarkable begins to happen when you stop wasting energy on what you cannot control. Your presence changes. Your confidence changes. People begin noticing something different about you. A steadiness, a composure, a quiet authority. Because calmness naturally creates influence. You have learned how to release what is beyond your reach. Now it's time to become the kind of person whose calmness influences everyone around them. Here's the fully rewritten Chapter 9 in a more natural, human, emotionally engaging audiobook style while preserving the original structure, lessons, and length. Chapter 9. Become the calmest person in the room. Most people believe leadership begins the day someone hands them authority. A title, a promotion, a corner office, a management role, a badge, a position that officially says, "You're in charge." But real leadership starts much earlier than that, long before the title, long before the recognition, long before anyone gives you permission. True leadership begins with emotional control, because whenever pressure enters a room, something predictable happens. People start looking for stability. They start looking for certainty. They start looking for someone who appears grounded when everyone else feels unsettled. Someone who seems composed when emotions begin running high. Someone who remains steady when circumstances become uncertain. And almost without realizing it, people begin following the calmest person in the room. That's the key. The calmest person leads. Remember that. The calmest person leads. People naturally place their trust in those who remain composed. Not because calmness magically solves every problem. Not because calm people always have the perfect answer. But because calmness communicates something important. It signals competence. It signals confidence. It signals emotional control. When everyone else becomes reactive, the calm person immediately stands out. When everyone else becomes overwhelmed, the calm person becomes noticeable. When everyone else loses perspective, the calm person becomes valuable. That is why calmness creates authority. Not forced authority. Not authority that comes from fear. Not authority that depends on a title. Natural authority. The kind people willingly follow. The kind that earns trust without demanding it. You have a choice. You can become another voice contributing to the chaos, or you can become the source of stability people are searching for. Most people unknowingly choose chaos. The calmest person leads. Think about a turbulent flight. The airplane suddenly begins shaking. The turbulence becomes severe. Passengers stop talking. People grip their armrests. Some begin imagining worst-case scenarios. The anxiety in the cabin slowly rises. And what do people do? They look around, not necessarily for answers, for reassurance. They watch the flight attendants. They watch the pilots. They pay attention to the people who appear most informed. If the crew remains calm, passengers begin calming down. If the crew looks concerned, fear spreads instantly. The situation hasn't changed. The turbulence is exactly the same. But perception changes everything. That's the key. Calmness influences people more than most realize. Now consider leadership in business. A company faces uncertainty, revenue begins to decline, customers leave, deadlines are missed, projects become delayed, employees begin whispering in hallways, questions start circulating, people wonder what comes next. Everyone wants certainty. Everyone wants reassurance. And in that moment, the emotional state of the leader becomes incredibly important. If the leader panics, panic spreads. If the leader blames others, fear spreads. If the leader loses composure, confidence disappears. But if the leader remains steady, something remarkable happens. The The team begins to settle. People stop focusing on the problem and start focusing on solutions. Confidence slowly returns. Productivity improves. The emotional atmosphere changes. Why? Because emotions are contagious. Fear spreads, but calmness spreads too. The calmest person leads, not because they speak louder than everyone else, but because they influence the emotional direction of the room. And that is leadership. Now think about sports. Championship games are filled with pressure. Crowds are loud. Expectations are enormous. Every mistake feels magnified. Every decision seems important. The atmosphere becomes intense. Yet the athletes people respect most often share one characteristic: composure. They stay centered when everyone else becomes overwhelmed. They stay focused when distractions increase. They stay disciplined when emotions rise. That is why teammates trust them. Not because they never make mistakes, not because they are perfect, but because they are steady. Consistency creates trust, and trust creates influence. The calmest person leads. Notice something important. Leadership is not always verbal. Many people think leadership comes from speeches, from giving instructions, from motivating others, from saying the right words at the right time, and sometimes it does. But often leadership begins long before a single word is spoken. Your energy enters the room before your words. Remember that. Your energy enters the room before your words. Before people hear you, they feel you. They sense your emotional state. They notice your presence. They pick up on your attitude. If you are anxious, people feel it. If you are frustrated, people feel it. If you are fearful, people feel it. And if you are calm, they feel that too. That's the key. Presence communicates constantly, even in silence, even when you say nothing, even when you're simply standing in the room. This is why emotional self-mastery is leadership. The person who struggles to lead themselves will struggle to lead others. The person who cannot control their reactions will struggle to influence a group. The person who cannot remain steady under pressure becomes difficult to trust. And people rarely trust unpredictability. It's not about charisma. It's about discipline. It's not about being impressive. It's about being dependable. Dependability creates authority. Authority creates influence. Influence creates leadership. The calmest person leads. You have a choice. Every difficult situation presents the same question. Will you contribute to the panic? Or will you contribute to the solution? Will you add fear? Or will you add stability? Will you become another source of emotional noise? Or will you become a source of clarity? That decision matters more than most people realize, because every group takes emotional cues from the people around them. Think about your family. Think about your workplace. Think about your friendships. Think about your community. Every group develops emotional habits, and very often those habits are shaped by a few key individuals. One calm person can stabilize an entire room. One emotional person can destabilize it. One disciplined person can create confidence. One reactive person can create confusion. That is the power of emotional influence, and most people underestimate it. The calmest person leads. Now let's go deeper. Presence becomes power, not power over people. Power with people. The power to influence outcomes, the power to create confidence, the power to reduce unnecessary fear, the power to improve decision-making, the power to help others think clearly when emotions threaten to take over. When people trust your emotional stability, they become more willing to trust your judgment. That is why emotional self-mastery is one of the most valuable leadership skills a person can develop. Because emotional self-mastery creates credibility. And credibility creates influence. That's the key. People trust what feels stable. People trust what feels grounded. People trust what feels reliable. And reliability begins within, not externally, internally. That is why calmness cannot remain just a technique. It must become part of your identity. Not something you occasionally practice. Not something you remember only when life becomes difficult. An identity, a way of being. The kind of person who remains thoughtful. The kind of person who remains composed, the kind of person who remains disciplined, even when circumstances become challenging, especially when circumstances become challenging. Your energy enters the room before your words. Never forget that. Before you speak, people observe. Before you lead, people evaluate. Before you influence, people feel. And what are they feeling from you? Confidence or uncertainty, stability or chaos, discipline or impulsiveness? The answer matters. Because leadership begins before communication. Leadership begins with presence, and presence begins with self-control. You don't need anyone's permission to become that person. You don't need a title. You don't need recognition. You don't need formal authority. You don't need a special position. The moment you begin mastering yourself, you begin influencing others. Naturally, quietly, powerfully. That's the key. The calmest person leads. And this lesson brings us closer to the final transformation of this audiobook. You have learned how to stop reacting. You have learned how to avoid absorbing the chaos of others. You have learned how to master the first 5 minutes. You have learned how to separate facts from fear. You have learned stillness, discipline, detachment, preparation, leadership. But one final piece remains, because lasting calmness does not come from techniques alone. It comes from identity. From the story, you repeatedly tell yourself about who you are. You have learned how to become the calmest person in the room. Now it's time to become the kind of person who cannot be shaken by the room at all. Chapter 10. Build an identity that cannot be shaken. Throughout this audiobook, we've spent time talking about habits. We've talked about reactions, about discipline, about calmness, about stillness, focus, emotional control. We've explored what it means to remain steady when life becomes uncertain. We've discussed how to stay grounded when people around you are losing their footing. But now we've arrived at the deepest lesson of all. The lesson beneath every technique. The lesson beneath every strategy. The lesson that determines whether any of these principles will actually stay with you long after this audiobook ends. Because techniques alone are not enough. Strategies alone are not enough. Even habits by themselves are not enough. If you want lasting calmness, real calmness, the kind that remains with you through setbacks, disappointments, uncertainty, and pressure, you must change something deeper. You must change your identity. That's the key. Long-term calmness comes from identity, not techniques. Many people spend years trying to improve their behavior while never addressing the person behind the behavior. They focus on actions. They focus on routines. They focus on temporary motivation. But they ignore identity. And eventually, identity wins. It almost always does. Sooner or later, your behavior returns to whatever you truly believe about yourself. That's why so many people improve for a while and then drift back into old patterns. The strategy changed. The self-image didn't. The behavior improved. The identity remained untouched. And identity has a powerful way of pulling behavior back toward itself. That's the key. The person you believe yourself to be determines the actions you consistently take. Think about it. A person who sees themselves as disciplined naturally behaves differently from someone who sees themselves as careless. A person who views themselves as calm approaches challenges differently from someone who sees themselves as emotionally fragile. A person who believes they are resilient responds differently than someone who believes they are easily overwhelmed. Identity drives behavior. Behavior reinforces identity. And the cycle continues, day after day, year after year. This is why the final transformation isn't simply learning how to stay calm. It's becoming someone who stays calm. There is a difference, a massive difference. This is who I am. Remember those words, this is who I am. Not, I'm trying to stay calm. Not, I hope I stay calm. Not, I stay calm when everything is going well. No. Something deeper, something stronger. This is who I am. That is the shift. The moment calmness becomes part of your identity, everything begins to change. Because identity removes negotiation. The disciplined person doesn't wake up every morning debating whether discipline is necessary. They act according to who they believe they are. The honest person doesn't negotiate honesty every day. Honesty has become part of their identity. The reliable person doesn't constantly debate whether they should keep their word. Keeping their word is simply who they are. And the calm person doesn't spend every difficult moment asking whether they should remain composed. They remain composed because that is who they have become. That's the key. Identity simplifies behavior. You have a choice. You can continue seeing yourself as someone controlled by circumstances, or you can begin seeing yourself as someone who remains steady regardless of circumstances. That choice matters, because the story you tell yourself eventually becomes the life you live. Now let's talk about self-image. Most people underestimate its influence. They think actions create identity, and to some extent they do. But the relationship works both ways. Identity influences action. Action reinforces identity, and together they create the life you experience. The way you see yourself affects your decisions. The decisions you make reinforce how you see yourself. That's why personal standards matter so much. A standard is simply a decision about who you are, not who you wish you were, not who you hope to become someday, who you are. For example, I do not panic. That is a standard. I do not allow emotions to control my behavior. That is a standard. I remain composed under pressure. That is a standard. Standards are powerful because they eliminate excuses, they reduce negotiation, they remove uncertainty. This is who I am. That's the key. The strongest people are guided by standards, not moods, not emotions, not temporary circumstances, standards. The average person asks, "How do I feel today?" The disciplined person asks, "Who am I?" One question changes every day, the other remains constant, and consistency creates strength. This is who I am. Now let's connect everything you've learned throughout this journey. You learned to stop reacting. Why? Because calmness became part of your identity. You learned not to absorb the emotional chaos of others. Why? Because calmness became part of your identity. You learned to control the first 5 minutes after bad news. Because calmness became part of your identity. You learned to separate facts from fear. Because calmness became part of your identity, you practiced stillness, you protected your energy, you prepared before pressure arrived, you detached from things outside your control, you learned to lead through composure. Why? Because calmness became part of your identity. Notice the pattern. The techniques matter. They absolutely matter. But identity is what makes those techniques automatic. That's the key. When identity changes, behavior becomes easier, not effortless, not perfect, but easier. Because you're no longer fighting yourself. You're no longer relying on motivation. You're no longer depending on willpower every single day. Instead, you're acting in alignment with who you believe you are. You don't need anyone's permission to become that person. You don't need external validation. You don't need perfect circumstances. You don't need everyone to understand your journey. This is your decision, your identity, your standard, your life. You have a choice. Every challenge that appears from this point forward presents the same opportunity to reinforce the old identity or strengthen the new one. Every setback, every criticism, every delay, every inconvenience, every difficult conversation, every unexpected problem, each one asks the same question: who are you? Not what do you feel, not what are you afraid of, who are you? And your answer determines your response. This is who I am. Now let's talk about the final transformation. Most people can remain calm occasionally, when conditions are favorable, when stress is low, when life is cooperating, when circumstances are manageable. But that's not what we're building here. We're building something stronger, something deeper, something far more reliable. A person who remains steady regardless of circumstances. A person who remains centered during uncertainty. A person who remains disciplined during adversity. A person who remains calm while others fall apart. That is the goal. Not occasional calmness, consistent calmness, not temporary control, lasting self-mastery. That's the key. The world will continue changing. People will continue disappointing you. Unexpected challenges will continue appearing. Pressure will continue arriving. Life offers no guarantee of perfect conditions, and it never will. But your identity does not depend on perfect conditions. Your standards do not depend on perfect conditions. Your discipline does not depend on perfect conditions. This is who I am, and because this is who I am, I remain steady. Say it again: I remain steady. When problems appear, I remain steady. When uncertainty arrives, I remain steady. When criticism finds me, I remain steady. When pressure increases, I remain steady. Not because life is easy, but because discipline is stronger than circumstance. That's the key. The strongest people are not protected from difficulty. They are prepared for it. The strongest people are not free from fear. They have simply grown larger than fear. The strongest people are not immune to stress. They refuse to hand control over to stress. And eventually, that refusal becomes identity. I remain steady. This is who I am. These are no longer motivational phrases. They are declarations, standards, commitments, a way of living. Because the true purpose of this audiobook was never to teach you a collection of techniques. The real purpose was transformation, to help you become someone different, someone stronger, someone calmer, someone more disciplined, someone whose peace is no longer dependent on circumstances, someone whose mind remains clear when others become overwhelmed, someone whose presence creates stability wherever they go, someone who remains steady while others fall apart. I remain steady. This is who I am. And when that identity finally takes root, deeply, permanently, completely, calmness is no longer something you practice. It is no longer something you remember. It is no longer something you try to do. It becomes who you are. And once that happens, very little in this world can shake you. The lesson of this audiobook is not that life will become easier. It won't. Problems will still appear. People will still disappoint you. Plans will still fail. Unexpected challenges will still arrive. But you now understand something that most people never learn. The person who wins is rarely the person who panics first. The person who wins is the one who remains clear when others become confused, the one who remains focused when others become emotional, the one who remains steady when others become unstable. Remember the principles. Pause before reacting. Separate facts from fear. Protect your energy. Control what you can. Train calm every day. Become the calmest person in the room. And most importantly, build an identity that cannot be shaken by temporary circumstances. Starting today, I challenge you to do one thing. The next time pressure appears, do not react immediately. Pause. Breathe. Observe. Think. Then act. Because every time you choose calm over chaos, you become stronger. Every time you choose discipline over panic, you become wiser. And every time you remain steady while others fall apart, you become the person this world desperately needs. Now go prove it.